and welcome. My name is Piers and Chad. This is the DeFi Download, a show about all things crypto, where we dive into the details of the projects, assets, and services that are driving the DeFi revolution. I am the CEO of Radix, a public ledger entirely focused on bringing DeFi into the mainstream. And today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be doing a debate format. And so with me today to do the debate is Chad Barrowford. Chad, would you like to just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Chad Barrowford. I'm a core developer on the THORChain project. Be fun to come on here and talk all things and have a small and fun debate. It'd be it'd be a lot of fun, I think. But I do want to say that that the statements that I make are my own view and perception, not of the THORChain project and not of the THORChain community. So please take that with thought.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I should say also that in a debate format, each participant takes a extreme view. Like we both may believe a combination of both our views, but to properly bring a debate format to life, each participant takes an extreme view of the position, and I'm sure we'll have a really interesting debate, and then we can sort of discuss some of the nuances afterwards. So the debate today is going to be: this house believes that single chain or single public ledger is the future, the only future possible long-term for DeFi. And Chad, I will be taking the position that single chain is the future of DeFi, and Chad will be taking the position that multi-chain is the future of DeFi. But again, really important to emphasize, these are not necessarily what we truly believe. This is just an opportunity for both sides of the debate to be properly aired and have a chance to argue with each other. So without further ado, as I am representing the House, I will do the opening arguments, and then Chad, I'll pass it over to you. We will start with 3 minutes apiece. So I think that Let's just look at what the things that are important in decentralized finance are. One of the key things that is important in decentralized finance is something that I call zero block time finance. So like atomic composability is often like the technical term, but it's this idea that I can say, right, I want this application, this financial application to do a thing, and I want this financial application to do a thing, and I want this financial application to do a thing, and I want them all to happen together or not to happen at all. A great example of this is Flash loans, where I can borrow from one protocol, say Aave, trade across something like Uniswap, and then repay the loan and do it all inside a single block. And the reason that this is so important is because we had some early DeFi projects like Ether Delta and stuff like that, where it was multi-confirmation, where you first did one thing, you waited for a confirmation, then did the next thing, you waited for a confirmation. And all of the instances that I see that are multi-chain is you have two different types of consensus, and you have different consensus times. So you're always going to be waiting for things to happen on both ledgers. Now, why do I care so much about zero confirmation finance? The reason I care so much about zero confirmation finance is because it's what actually drives the sophisticated liquidity in the decentralized finance space. The thing that is king for DeFi is liquidity, and liquidity only occurs when it's easy to move between opportunities. And so the biggest part of this liquidity that makes sure that pricing within decentralized finance applications like Uniswap and things like that stays consistent with the pricing on things like Binance and other places, and indeed consistent between Uniswap and SushiSwap and other places like that, is the ability to compose together these financial primitives within a single block, not have to wait any block time to be able to do that. And while the everyday user doesn't necessarily care about that, they don't necessarily care about the ability to do flash loans and compose finance together, because all they care about is going to Uniswap and doing a single swap. What the result is that very large amounts of capital can move in and take arbitrage opportunities that would not be possible in block time, in multiple block time, but is possible in a single block, and create the best possible pricing and the highest possible liquidity in every single application that exists on top of these ledgers. The other thing I'd say in scope, when we look at the history of network effects tend to accrue over time to single networks, not multi-networks. So the internet started as multiple competing networks, and it ended up being a single aggregated network. Now, there are some debating points on that for sure, but if you look at things like Google or Facebook or Twitter, most of those have become dominant in their field because the network effects of all of the users being on the same platform was so beneficial. And fundamentally, that is my position for why single chain will end up dominating in time rather than multi-chain.
All right. All right. Should I respond to what you just said, or should I come up with my own arguments here?
You can start with your own argument, and then in the next point, I will be responding to you, and you can respond to me after that. You could feel like setting the stage to start off with.
Yeah. So I think you and I agree on the concept that liquidity is very important within the context of DeFi. I don't think it's hard to find somebody who disagrees with that statement for sure. And I think the inherent problem is that we tend to see more and more DeFi protocols and DeFi networks being created across the space, right? Whether that's Ethereum, whether that's Avalanche, whether that's Terra, whether that's Solana, whether that's Radix, like all these different protocols all have the pros and their cons. They're doing different things and solving different problems, right, within the same space, like kind of that same umbrella of DeFi. And the inherent problem with that is that you get to a very fragmented state. So you're fragmenting liquidity across multiple networks, and then some very starved, in terms of like assets and volatility and all these things. And that can become a big problem over the long term. My hope and my intention is that we're moving towards a space where what chain that you're operating on or the assets you want to hold, it becomes benign. It doesn't really matter. It isn't like whether you're a Bitcoin maxi or Doge maxi or a Radix maxi or whatever it might be. That you have access to DeFi no different than anybody else, and every chain and every asset is treated identically. Everybody has the same. Everybody's treated as a first-class citizen, and that's really key. I think that's very important. If we get to a place where everybody becomes a very fragmented system, and you were saying about Google, everything kind of goes towards one thing, like Google and all these things, which is true within the context of a specific feature set, right? Like I'm going to search for the web, I'm going to use Google because I don't know, Google's good, it works very well. Or maybe if you're like security minded, you might use DuckDuckGo, for example, or maybe just like a Microsoft Maxi, you'll use Bing for whatever reason or purpose. Doesn't really matter. But you're right that like the 90-something percent, 95%, whatever the number is, all use Google. But that's not necessarily a great comparison in this context because there are different apps in the internet that do different things. Google does one app, right? Facebook is another thing, right? We have different applications or purposes, and you're not going to have Google control like internet searches, social media, online commerce, and that's never going to happen, right? And so DeFi is that. DeFi is not so much AMM. There's also lending, and there's derivatives and perpetuals and like all sorts of different things. And then if one thing is going to become the master of the entire DeFi space, that would go against everything we ever seen in technological history. Like it's never happened that one person or one thing becomes. At least in a free market, that's true. That's not. In China, it might be a little bit different because they control everything. But in a free market, that's probably not going to be true. I love what they're doing over there at Solana. I love what they're doing over there at Terra, like Radix. Like you do all doing really good work in solving different and interesting problems and having different approaches, which means there's also different use cases of why you'd use A versus B, which is also why you may not have A be the dominant killer of everything. Over the long tail. Ethereum is the dominant player now, and it has been for years because it's largely been the only player for the last 5 years effectively. There really hasn't been much real competition against it, and I'm hoping to see that to change. I think Cosmos is going to play a big role in that. I think Polkadot's going to play a big role in that. Even Radix can play a big role in that as well for sure. Like a lot of different protocols coming out there are offering really good value. And I think we're going to see a lot of these take off. And I think from THORChain's perspective, or rather my perspective, is that I think that you'll be able to pull from any one of these things use the pros at any given time of Monero versus the pros of Bitcoin versus the pros of Radix, and be able to pull these things as you see fit for yourself and have composability cross-chain. And I think that's where I would like to see things heading at least.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you. I think I'm going to just respond to a couple of the points, and I think there's some really interesting ones in there. The first is that what level are we talking about here? I think that the difference between sort of Google and Facebook and these kind of applications that we're talking about is that they are merely applications built on a single collected piece of infrastructure known as the internet. And what the difference between the internet is versus Google or Facebook is that the internet is a decentralized network, not really owned by anyone, but has enforced a collective standard on how information is transferred. And for me, this whole space is about enforcing a collective standard on how money is represented and transferred, on how finance is built and represented and transferred. That you are creating a place in which competition can occur on top of that infrastructure. But the reason that capital loves it is because capital can move so easily between those applications once built on top of that infrastructure. So if we are talking about single companies, I absolutely agree with you. You're right, but we're not. We're talking about decentralized infrastructure on which the world is going to choose where it keeps its capital, where it allocates its capital. Now, right now, we are in a multi-chain world. I 100% agree with that. We have these wonderful protocols like Radix, like Cosmos, like Terra, like EOS, like Solana, etc. They are there competing with each other to be that substrate that the world decides the standard for finances is built on top of. But the reason that we love standards, the reason that standards emerge within society is because they create a useful shorthand on which to build everything that subsequently comes. The internet has created that useful standard and has meant that a huge amount of humanity has prospered from that created shared standard of simply sending data packets across the internet. I think that's what's about to emerge here. And the starting point of a competitive open market on which all those decentralized ledgers can start to emerge, I think is an essential part of the emergence of creating the right standards, the best standards that can learn from each other, that can compete. But eventually, the gravity of one of those standards will mean that capital more and more tends towards that single piece of infrastructure because it is more convenient to do so. And I think that as humans, as a species, we continually move towards convenience and simplicity, and that the convenience and simplicity of a single chain infrastructure, a single ledger infrastructure, long term will mean that capital will tend towards that place, will mean that creators will tend towards that place, and that place, as it grows in its network effects, will eventually become the de facto place where all of it is done, because at some point it makes more sense for any given application to decide to re-implement themselves on that dominant ledger than it does to spend the extra work and time and effort to do all of the bridging between. Because let's face it, bridging between protocols is difficult. It costs a lot of money. It's expensive in extra sort of development effort and time. You have to do multiple integrations. You've got to do lots and lots of support. So while we exist in this multi-chain world, bridging is essential, but bridging will also be the point that ultimately means that one of these protocols will be the dominant gravitational force for capital, and that it will eventually emerge as the only place or the main place that DeFi exists in the long term.
Well, one thing I would respectfully agree on is that you referred to the internet as kind of like this kind of global computer, if you will, or infrastructure. And I don't think that's actually necessarily true. The internet is not an infrastructure. It's not an implementation. It's a protocol, right? It's clearly defined IEEE protocols, whether it be email protocol, whether it be HTTP protocol, TCP, like all these things. They're not actually, they don't exist at all in the world other than just being written down as a communication standard between contract A and contract B, whatever that might be. And so there is no agreed upon infrastructure within the internet. There is not. There is agreed upon protocols, correct, but implementation and infrastructure is categorically a completely different concept. Implementation is very different. Now, the internet connects and communicates in ways that it doesn't require two different websites, in a sense, to agree on the status of things, two completely separate and isolated things from each other, two different corporate entities, if you want to call them that. It doesn't. Most of the time, that's not actually true, right? And so there's just one person who has all the information about eBay, and you go to eBay, and you don't need to get this, Facebook to understand eBay status in order for them. That doesn't happen in the Web 2.0, and that's partially what we're trying to think about in the Web 3.0 world. But whether or not we head towards a single source of DeFi, that's tough. That's a really tough thing to do. In all cases, which you're going to have to say, it's going to be, we'll make up a new company. We're going to call it DeFi Land, whatever. I'm making it up, right? And DeFi Land wants to become the DeFi place, like where everybody's going to rush to and become the thing. That's a hard sell because you're going to have to convince everybody in the world to do that. And in technology, that almost never happens, right? How many programming languages do you personally know? I know probably about a dozen. Does that mean that we all settle on a particular language? Hell no. I mean, that's true for JavaScript. It's our only choice, other than maybe Dart. But like, that's a different conversation. I can rant how much I hate JavaScript. But generally speaking, that's not the case. But we almost never converge onto a certain single technology. I mean, even within the MySQL space, you have like MySQL, and you have like Postgres, and you have like MariaDB, and like everybody uses these things for different purposes at different cases and different scenarios, and there's no consensus of what like the dominant thing is even within databases, right? Is it Oracle? Is it MySQL? Is it like MongoDB? Is it blockchain? Like all these things are different. They have different use cases, and so I don't think we get to a place where like one entity, and it's hard to debunk. Ethereum is like currently that entity. If you want to push towards it, that's like current, objectively speaking, right? And whether you agree with Ethereum or not is a different thing.
No,
but like,
I 100% agree.
They're the thing, and so you have to convince. They have like that. They have that kind of that headroom, right? That kind of leeway. Like they're the kind of first shooter in a sense, right? And so you have to go against that kind of that grain in a sense and convince those. I think it's like 60,000 developers of Solidity to come over to my new DeFi land protocol, whatever it is, with this thing that has all these features, blah, 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 X, Y, and Z, whatever the hell they are. And that's it's an uphill battle, right? It becomes, we've seen a lot of people try to do this. And just because people have failed in the past doesn't mean that new ones come along will also fail, of course. But it's hard. It's an uphill battle to convince the dev community that this is the protocol, like, because it's going to have its pros, it's going to have its cons, and whether you like that or no, we want something that's more decentralized than this chain. That's not, it's somewhat decentralized, but not decentralized enough. Or we need something that has cheaper gas fees, or we don't mind if it's more expensive gas fees for the application type that we're building. And so everything is going to have different design requirements, and therefore having a single chain say that we can satisfy all design choices and all design requirements, come to us. It seems unlikely to me.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, and like, thank you. That was really interesting. I really appreciate you agreeing to the debate format. It's not everyone that will put themselves on the line and be willing.
This is my first debate ever, so I'm kind of like getting trial by fire in this context.
No, it was great. I decided not to do the like the formal like in debating you're actually taught to argue in a certain way, and I decided against doing the formal way because it's a little bit aggressive. So I was like, I'll do a more relaxed version.
Suck, Piers.
Yeah. I think my honourable friend is rather at a loss for his senses. For no, I'm just. Really interesting. I think there's like lots of points of contention. Which, so every time I don't know if you're similar to me, but every time I like approach a completely new area of technology or understanding, is I always reach for analogies, and like the analogies reach a certain point and then they break, and it's like. This is a protocol. You're right, and the decentralized ledgers, permissionless ledgers, are protocols, but they're also data standards because it's stateful. Like the difference between the internet and something like Ethereum or Radix is that the internet has no memory of the data that passed across it, whereas a ledger is stateful. It has to have a memory, and that statefulness does enforce a certain amount of standardization. Otherwise you don't know what the state is. The question is whether or not like these are going to continue to become more and more modular, where we're like, okay, we have the consensus layer, and then we have the state storage layer, and like then we have the execution environment. We can have several that can all agree on the same state layer, and then you have the programming environment, the programming language, and then the compilers, and like all of this becomes more and more modular, and then it sort of becomes very difficult to say, well, what is the dominant thing? for me, it's still that like agreement on state. How do you come to an agreement with what the state is? That may be the a thing that it tends towards a single way of doing it, in the same way the internet has a standard for sending information, regardless whether or not you're doing HTTPS or TCP and like all of that kind of stuff. There are two, like there's TCP, and then there's the other one which I always forget, which is like, here's all of this information.
There's a bunch of different formats of how you can transmit data over the internet. And TCP/IP is there's a base layer, then HTTP sits on top of that, and there's actually other forms too that which nobody really uses very much anymore. I mean, you're right. The vast majority of people use those two protocols as they're clearly defined. But I doubt we're going to get to a place where we actually have like protocols like HTTP cross chain, because there's too much variance between one chain to the next. There's too much like some chains have instant finality on them, like Cosmos chains tend to do, or any proof of stake network tends to do.
Radix, which is a but it's also it's a finality, it's a safety preferring rather than liveness preferring network, which means that you have deterministic finality, which means that once it's final, it's final. You can't. There's no rollbacks or anything.
Yeah, and on the other side of that spectrum, you have like something that does not have instant finality, like Bitcoin being probably the most famous case, and how people tend to say you should wait 6 blocks for confirmation, which doesn't actually make sense. But like that has its values for why you would want that. Like sometimes like you want that because with that comes a greater level of decentralization that you really can't get with any proof of stake network on the planet, at least the one that I'm aware of. None of them actually can achieve the decentralization level of Bitcoin, and so that's solving a different set. It's prioritizing decentralization and security as its most important things. Performance, like we don't care performance so much. It can be only 7 transactions per second and 10-minute block times on average, all that stuff. But that makes sense in the context of the problem they're trying to solve, like they as in the Bitcoin network itself. But you and I are involved in building our own proof of stake networks, which is trying to solve a different problem with different design requirements and attributes that makes using proof of work in our context of what we're trying to do, you and I, doesn't make much sense to use proof of work. It's like you need that instant finality. Otherwise, you can get all sorts of wacky situations that would just like cause data to be like so problematic. And like you need that finality to be able to do like, to transact in ways of like generating yield and like, all these things. And so like we need that, you and I, in terms of things that you and I are working on as individuals. So there's that trade-off, right? And DeFi in general probably needs to be have its instant finality in order to be viable, I think.
Right. Yeah. No, I think so too. Because like as soon as you have more than one application that you're talking to at any given time, and if you have probabilistic finality and you have rollbacks, like my mind starts to literally explode when I try and think about the complexity of like a flash loan.
Yes.
And that only increases the more applications are interconnected.
Yes.
And this was for me. This idea of Metcalfe's law, which is like a network's value is the square of the number of people in the network. I think with DeFi, it's now the network's value is something like the square of the number of applications that can be composed together, or that can interplay with each other, times the capital held in the network. Because it's not just capital; it's the liquidity that can move between these different applications. And the more ways you can do that, the more valuable the network becomes as a square of itself.
Yep.
The other analogy that I often reach for, and this I think argues more for the multi-chain always view, is I think in many ways we are founding digital countries. Like you can think of, especially a democracy, you can think of a democracy kind of being a little bit like a DAO. Like you can, the entire populace can change everything about the leadership of said DAO. You elect delegates to do that. There is some income, and that income is decided to be spent on the citizens' benefit in some way, and then the country then competes for talent, enterprise, and ultimately trade. And to do that, tries to make its country as attractive to people to build their companies within it, because that benefits the country through tax revenues and through, higher standard of living for their citizens, and that the country is competing against other countries for talent to and brains and enterprise to come and build in their countries. And like, you could say that DeFi and these and layer ones is sort of a microcosm of that. And we haven't tended towards one country. There have been empires and stuff like that, but we have tended towards a multi-country world. And so maybe that's the right analogy. But then there's things that break down in there as well. Like it's every time I reach for an analogy and I think I found a good one, I'm like, oh, this is a good one, and then I'm like, yeah, but it's not quite the same.
Since you're at least momentarily arguing for a multi-chain world, I'll switch roles with you, and I'll go single chain just for a moment. Cool. And on your analogy, in that you can look at the individual countries of the world, and they're all highly isolated countries if you go back in time. And as trade increases, as communication increases, as technology pushes these countries and these cultures forward, they become a little bit more blurred, right? Like, as we got the airplane, right? Like, there's more people who live in England today than they did, more foreigners rather. Like, more Americans are living in England today, in part because the airplane makes it more viable for me to go visit either as a tourist or live there. And I've spent some time in England. It's a great country. And so, like, that kind of starts to blur the lines a little bit of like what countries are. Like, England it kind of goes reverse a little with the EU kind of backing out of that whole thing. But like, that was like the European Union coming together and saying, like, let's get all these countries and get a currency that we all most of us agree on, and then economics and all these things. And I think over time maybe that will happen. Like, we'll have more and more countries. Maybe the Africa will come together in a similar sense, or maybe the Americas, North and South, will come. I don't know. I'm just like throwing out some push right now, but we do see that over time, even though we have these separate entities, they kind of become more like one, right? And I think at least in America, the liberal perspectives towards that idea, and the conservative perspective is like let's put up our walls and like isolate ourselves from the heathens around us, or whatever you want to call them, right? So, and your example, like, you're right, we have all these different countries, they have all the different attributes. We're trying to convince other people to come to my country where you can do X, Y, and Z, get this education, have more freedom, blah, 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 whatever the selling point might be. But we're also staying in a place where we're actually becoming more of a world, like a one world today than we did 100 years ago. I think I'm assuming we're going to continue that and become more of a one world with separate entities within it. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like, we have agreed on at least some standards globally. Like, land is a good place to be. We can't live in the sea and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, like, I
don't know, that famous inventor, not inventor, but the investor, what's his name? I can't remember his name. He wanted to create like an ocean world, using like shipping containers to create like a city on. What was that guy's name?
No, I don't remember.
To
but
Twitter,
I know who you mean.
And like very, very famous Silicon Valley investor. I can't remember his name right now. I wish I could. But he was really talking about like,
sounds like Peter Thiel might say.
Peter Thiel, that's it. That's exactly what it was. Peter Thiel.
Okay. It was.
And
Peter
he was
Thiel.
like, let's create like a shipping container world on the ocean, right? Which is like probably the most like libertarian idea I've ever heard of in my life.
Yeah, because the law of the ocean. Once you're in international waters,
you're international waters, man. You can do whatever you want.
I think that the one thing that I think is so important in the space right now is all of the competition. And I think that the things that, like what THORChain is doing, is incredibly important in the space, because I actually think for a long time, regardless of I do actually think it is inevitable that we will tend towards a single ledger dominance overall, and that's not necessarily because I think Radix is going to be it. I just think that is where we just are animals of convenience, and so like we only remember the top one or two brands in any given category, and we tend towards them. And then if you add all of this convenience to it, of like the same assets being there, the composability or the ease of like doing business, all that kind of stuff. However, I think that that's actually a long way away. If that future does emerge, it's a long way away. And stuff like THORChain is so important for people to be able to move liquidity between these ledgers to be able to help the competition. Like, the things like THORChain mean that it's more likely that the best solution will win, because it means that liquidity is able to move out of less good solutions and into more good solutions more easily, and is going to be an incredibly important long-term part of that infrastructure for sure.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I mean, I think one of the things about THORChain that is really important is that it's trying to give people choice and the ability to choose for yourself what you want without the requirement of somebody else saying okay or not okay, or like trying to identify everybody in the world. And like it's actually really important. Like if you want a free system where everybody has like equal access, then you have to advocate and build for it, right? And so I'm not here to say that Ethereum's the killer, or EOS or Cardano or Radix or whatever. Like I actually have very little opinion on this matter of like who is going to be the winner. I'm not really one with a crystal ball, so I don't really actually know. What I do know is that if you look over time, the number of chains layer ones are being created are increasing, and it's increasing at an increasing rate, right? Like it's actually not. It's not like tipping, like, oh, we're starting to merge onto one. Like it's actually the opposite. Right. We're seeing more. We're seeing chains like Radix, who has its own attributes, its own value proposition, which is very interesting, and then be able to like convince people like this is a good use for. Like I wouldn't want, if I was going to build the New York Stock Exchange, I would not build that on Ethereum. That would make no sense for like a bunch of different reasons. Maybe like Solana would be a good option. Maybe Radix would be a good option for that particular use case. And so maybe I'd build it on the Radix, blockchain, or using Cerebus as a consensus mechanism for it all. Like I might do that, right? And so, but over time, I don't think we're going to slow up on other layer one options, and because I don't think anybody's really agreeing that like we have found the solution, and I don't think we ever do that in technology, especially in dev. Like we're still creating new programming languages today. Like we've been around for 60 plus years, and like we've dismissed some old ones. Nobody uses Pascal anymore, or Cobalt, and these kinds of things. But like C is still a thing, and like Java is still a thing, and like JavaScript and Go and Python and Ruby and all those things exist, and they will always exist. But they will be used for different contexts and purposes. I wouldn't build a Twitter with Python. I love Python. I use it all the time for like fun little scripts and whatever else. I've built some apps in Python in the past, but I wouldn't use it for like high computing, high transactions and high volume requests. I'd probably use something like Go, or maybe Rust, or maybe C or Java, or like one of these kind of lower level languages, because it's a better use case for the thing I'm trying to build. And I don't think any blockchain will ever be able to say we have solved all the problems and we have all the things. It's always going to be a con and a pro and a con to every blockchain out there. And I don't mean that as a diss. Like THORChain has its own pros and cons, and its blockchain as well. Like they're all going to have pros and cons, and because of that, there will never be a winner, because there'll never be a blockchain that actually solves everything. And that's the same thing with the internet. Like there's never been anything on the internet that solved everything. That's why we have URLs. Otherwise, there'd just be one URL you go to, and it would give you everything. But we don't have that. We have a ton of URLs. And each one URL gives me a certain value or proposition that I want to participate with, whether it be Netflix, Apple, or something else. It's going to have a different attraction, different purpose that I want to use it. And so I don't think we'll ever have a blockchain that actually gives you the solution for all things, and therefore there will never be a single chain that actually dominates everything.
Yeah, I mean, like
even with the DeFi space, I would even make that statement. Even broader, that makes definitely more sense. Even within DeFi, it's still true.
Yeah, so like the interesting thing about, for me, the global financial system has essentially one job, which is the efficient allocation of capital, and the efficient allocation of capital is something that works better the more interconnected the system is. Because what you want to be able to do is move arbitrarily easily between opportunities. And at the moment, we're in this situation where some people are completely blocked out of the capital allocation machine, full stop. you know, the unbanked or the underbanked or the underserved from the financial institution, or like just people who don't have the right qualifications to be considered a sophisticated investor, and therefore don't have the opportunity to participate in some products and services. Or jurisdictionally, like, you know, if you're in India, it's really difficult to get certain financial services, partly because of the regulations of providing financial services as foreign companies and things like that. So like we're in a really bitty system at the moment, and it's all a bit crap, and everyone kind of has this nagging suspicion that they're getting screwed in some way or another. And now what's happening is like it is easily a 10x, even in a multi-chain world. It's easily a 10x on or even more, 100x on what we have at the moment, or at least the potential. Like Ethereum, with its gas fees, with its cost, with its congestion, with its like difficult user experience and all that kind of stuff, it is actually less than a 10x right now for a lot of people, especially if you live in the UK or in America and you can open Robinhood or, you know, Monzo or whatever. But like for lots of people, it is already significantly better. But we all collectively in the community believe that this is as in the crypto community believe that this is the direction of play in which we get the 10x 100x better than the financial system as it is today. So capital will move here. Like regardless of whether it's single chain or multi-chain, capital will move to these systems because it is so much better as a capital allocation tool. Programmatic money, where you can set rules and it can just move automatically, right? Like yield farming is a fantastic example. Automated yield farming is a fantastic example of like a very simple implementation of how you can make capital allocation an incredibly efficient, effective tool for people who want to allocate capital. So that convenience level, that we got a lot of headroom there. We had what DeFi is $200 billion under management at the moment. Global finance is $360 trillion, $400 trillion, depending on like how you're counting. There's a lot of headroom to grow. There's a lot of multi-chain that will continue to exist because like moving between chains, you know, using something like THORChain and getting confirmation times of 10 minutes or whatever it is between, you know, certain ledgers, but to finish a swap, that's miles better than waiting 5 days for something to clear or not being able to access something because of jurisdictional problems, right? Like, you know, I think in crypto we tend to obsess about these things. We're like, oh my god, it's 10 minutes transaction time. You're like, yeah, like that's really good compared to the traditional world. So I think I agree that there is like going to be lots of discussions about the interesting, useful, competitive discussions about what's the best standards for things and so there will be lots of competitive capital, but we'll get to the point where the capital will move. And it'll all be there. And then optimizations will be about these small incremental improvements and you know, where I can move something within, you know, 5 seconds versus within a minute is going to start to matter because the capital, like the global financial system cares about nothing but the efficient allocation of capital. You can save me money, then I will go there because I don't really care. And like you see that in liquidity mining, it's incredible how much money moves between ledgers already when there's a great opportunity. You know, Avalanche launched its program and huge amounts of liquidity move there, and then Phantom launched theirs and huge amounts of liquidity move there. And like it is just amazing to see that happen. I think that the next, like it for me, the question is, once we've won the wider battle of getting the global financial system onto our public ledgers, and winning the argument with capital allocators, like what does that next battle look like? And that's still why I'm like, eventually capital will choose the most convenient location, and that will be a single ledger, and that's sort of where my long-term view ends up going eventually.
Well, so there will always be in order for there to be one ledger, there would inherently mean, at least to me, that all other blockchains in the world basically go away or have very little economic value, right? So like, let's imagine that my DeFi land protocol that I'm imaginary creating right now, that it becomes the thing, the single chain bubble, your kind of scenario. Right. And then that means Ethereum basically dies and Bitcoin basically dies and all these other things basically die, which would be hard I don't see that happening. That would be a hard scenario to get.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. These things don't die. I agree with that. But like, if all of the assets that were created on Ethereum are represented, traded, held, allocated, all on another ledger, and Ethereum is kept just because of the representation of those assets is valuable, so it continues to perpetuate. Is that still a multi-chain world?
No. I would disagree. So, in order to do what you're describing, you have to use wrapped or pegged assets. Right. And for our audience, what that means is you are taking one Ethereum, you are locking it up in some sort of either smart contract or maybe a threshold signature or like some sort of mechanism that something is holding. And then on the other side, we're telling, the DeFi land chain that we're going to mint a new coin called, wrapped Ethereum. And then that will maintain a peg between this one-for-one thing. Now, there's no way you can really do that and maintain economic security without requiring trust. You actually cannot. This is not a viable way of going. This is what the people have done because it's the simplest, low-hanging fruit way of doing it. But economically, it actually makes zero sense, right? So you either require trust, like a WBTC, and you're giving money to a corporation, and you're just like, hey guys, I'm trusting you, so like don't steal the Bitcoin, run away. And then they're gonna give me like one WBTC on Ethereum, and they're like, okay, I'm holding this, guys. Like, are you still there? I have to check to make sure that the value of my WBTC doesn't go to zero tomorrow because somebody decides. Not that I'm saying WBTC is going to do that. I'm not trying to FUD WBTC or anything. I'm just using that as an example. But like,
yeah, screw those guys.
No.
WBTC.
I don't mean to shit on them or anything like that. But like, they provide a service for people, and they're welcome to use it if they choose, right? But that requires trust of them, right? Now, if you do something without trust and use some sort of like decentralized version of that, in almost every single one of those cases, the value of the asset that is securing this thing that's holding the Ethereum, and the value of the thing that's over there that is the assets that are being like secured are detached completely. So you might have $100 million worth of assets being using my DeFi land token or something like, or whatever it is, but we're securing $10 billion worth of assets. So, okay, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's almost like saying like, hey, Piers, if you give me $10, right, and we'll just put that in a safety deposit box, and if you do something bad, I'll take those $10 from you. Here's $10,000. Don't run away with it now. You might say, no, I'm going to run away with it now because I can lose my $10 and walk away with $10,000. That the economics are there. Like, show me the economics. And
I feel like that is a whole nother debate. Because like because there's easily a title.
But this is part. The reason why I bring it up is because this is part of the reason why you can't have a single chain world. Because if you agree with the idea that there are other chains that are still going to exist, Bitcoin is still going to exist, Ethereum is still going to exist. Dogecoin, love it, hate it. Cardano, love it, hate it. Like whatever your feelings are.
Shiba probably.
Shiba coin or baby Shiba Inu, or whatever your thing is. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm not trying to but like, if you believe that those things won't just die and the whole world would say DeFi coin is the only thing of value in the world and Bitcoin's, like my ass with those coins, then you have to have some sort of wrapped assets to get that liquidity. Otherwise, you're going to fragment the out of the liquidity of the DeFi. Then you have to get some mechanism to get it in there. And every mechanism we have using wrapped assets doesn't make any sense. It actually will not be the way of moving forward in the future. I believe that personally very strongly, which is why THORChain does not actually doesn't actually use wrapped assets because there's no viable means to secure it.
So you are a trust minimization maximalist.
I mean, I hate the term maximalist in general, to be honest with you. So I wouldn't call myself.
But the philosophy is we must in every single possible instance reduce the amount of trust that is required on any single party.
It depends on the use cases, but generally speaking, yes. There are cases where it makes sense to have trust, right? There are situations where it makes sense to have trust, where that might be needed. But there's situations where it doesn't, and so it depends on the situation. But my default stance is let's do this trustlessly, and then convince me of a reason not to do it. And if you can convince me of that, then maybe we.
Because I think I just come from like we're coming up on time here, but but the world exists outside of crypto. The majority of assets are non-crypto assets, like property, like commodities, like land, like all of this stuff that actually drives the real economy. And every single one of those will be on top of public ledgers, but the way that they will be through trusted bridges. There's no other way of doing it apart from having representation of trusted bridges for the bridging of assets into these ecosystems.
Yes.
So like whatever our future world will consist of, it will consist of entities that we trust to represent things on a ledger that ledger doesn't natively understand.
Yes, physical objects in the world is a different topic, and that might be an example of something where just the complete trustlessness is not.
But intangibles as well, like music rights, IP rights associated with owning a record, like all of those are not physical objects. They are legal fictions in many ways, but they are objects that we recognize as society. And again, you're still going to need for a very long time. Maybe sometime in the future we'll be able to do IP rights completely trustlessly.
I think that's possible. I'm not a lawyer by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's certainly possible. Even when you buy NFTs today, like each OpenSea and all these things have terms in service, and which actually define what the rights are, what you're buying, and there's different on different protocols, on different things. So what you don't really actually know what you're buying in terms of rights unless you read through those terms and conditions, and it's different. Sure. A different mechanism of acquiring, and that goes back to the rights thing that you're talking about. Like, what are the rights of an article, or a piece of music, or a piece of artwork, or some of these things, and that is a whole different topic that you should argue with somebody who knows what they're talking about, because they're definitely not me.
Right, because like in most law, so I did law, but like it is one of my degrees, but like as the in most jurisdictions, you need to have an identified person, either a legal person, i.e. a company, or an individual that is determined to be the owner. And like then that means that we have to change huge amounts of legislation. Again, definitely possible. But yeah, really interesting. Another really interesting debating topic. Anyway, it has been wonderful speaking with you, Chad. Thank you so much for your time. I think it's been a really great debate, and I really look forward to having another discussion with you another time about.
We'll do another debate. We'll pick another topic. We'll duke it out again.
If anyone wants to come and find out more about THORChain, where do they go, and what do they do?
So follow the project itself. Don't follow me. I don't matter. But I'm just a core dev. So like THORChain, @THORChain is a Twitter account. THORChain.org is the website. Go ahead and the great community. You can follow them and all these things. But it's a really good project. People should check it out. It's a very technically complex project, just like Radix is a very technically complex project. And yeah. Read more about it. The more you read about it, the more as soon as you get neck deep, you realize how significant this protocol can be for the world.
Thank you very much, Chad. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye-bye.